Hello, this is Dr. Eric Bricker, and thank you for watching AHealthcareZ. Today's topic is 9 behavioral economic strategies for doctor pay. Or in other words, this is what the experts say about doctor pay. Now, this comes from a research article that was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And essentially for internal medicine, which is what I am, an internist, it's called the Green Journal. It is the preeminent journal. And really, there's like New England Journal of Medicine, there's JAMA, but Annals is like one of the journals that's right up there, probably the next tier down, if you will. It's kind of odd that this was published in Annals and not in JAMA or New England, but to a certain extent, it is even more important that it was actually published in Annals. And it was published by really an all-star cast of physician researchers. And from UPenn, from Duke, from Kaiser Permanente, I mean, if you just go to this article and you look at the authors, it's like a who's who of healthcare economics, health services research, value-based payments research, et cetera, et cetera. Like, if there are going to be experts in America on this subject, the people who wrote this article are them. Now, what do they say about the 9 strategies for behavioral economics and physician pay? In other words, how should physician compensation be structured so as to change doctor behavior to improve quality, lower cost, increase access per patient? In other words, what are the strategies for physician compensation that should be used to improve patient care? Which, by the way, assumes, correctly so in my mind, that the current form of fee-for-service is not the right way to compensate physicians to improve patient care. So what do they say? Here are the 9 approaches in behavioral economics that can be and have been applied to physician compensation. Here we go. Number 1, limitations of information. What does this mean? This means that education alone is not enough. Oh, we'll just tell the doctors the right thing to do, and they'll just do it. Guess what? That does not work. They have to provide incentives that are both financial and non-financial as well. Education alone, just telling doctors what the right thing is to do, will not change their behavior. Isn't that fascinating? Next up, inertia and status quo bias. What does that mean? That means that people go with the flow. They go with defaults. They go with defaults. Therefore, use defaults. If you have behavior that you want to change, have that be the default in the physician order piece of paper. Have that be the default in the electronic medical record. Force them to have to choose outside of the default for a different behavior, whereas the default is what you want. I will add that the Intermountain Healthcare System did this with this care pathways. They made their care pathways the defaults in the hospital. Now, the doctor could be like, well, I don't want to use the default for this ventilator setting in the ICU, and you can do that, but the default was the standard of care or the evidence-based care that the hospital system wanted, already been used in practice. Next up, choice overload. If you increase the quality metrics for a physician, you actually decrease their behavior change. They've already done studies on this. So you want to change all these different behaviors. You do 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 12, 24, 46 different behaviors you're going to change. Guess what? The doctor's going to change less the more things that you try to measure. So what's the point? You kind of have to have a Goldilocks approach. You don't have 0. You don't have 46. But it's got to be a Goldilocks, not too few, not too many, when it comes to the number of choices or number of things that you're measuring for quality and patient care improvement. Next up, immediacy. Annual incentives are not frequent enough. They have found that increasing the frequency of both the financial and the non-financial incentives improves the actual behavior change. Do it weekly, do it monthly, do it quarterly. If you do it once a year, it's probably not frequent enough to change behavior. And this brings up an interesting point. What is it called to have to give people rewards more frequently during the year? What's that called? That's called more work, right? You'd be like, oh, I just want to do it once a year because that's easier for my staff. Well, guess what? If you want to do what works, you're going to have to do something that's harder for your staff, where you might have to give these incentives, financial non-incentives, out, again, weekly, monthly, quarterly. It requires more work. And that's a common theme throughout all of these, is that oftentimes the behavioral economic strategies that actually change behavior, the common thread through all these, more work. Takes me to that quote from, I believe it was from Thomas Edison, that says that, look, success oftentimes looks like somebody in overalls, right? And it just looks like hard work. So a lot of this is just kind of like a man or a woman in overalls doing hard work. Okay, next up, number 5, loss aversion, which is that people will work harder to avoid losing something than they will to gain something. And what that means is that, hey, maybe physicians should be given a bonus, and then they have to do certain behaviors in order to keep the bonus. And if they don't do those things, the bonus is taken away. That is more effective than withholding the bonus and then hoping that they'll do certain behaviors and then giving them the bonus at the end of X period of time. Okay, next up, relative social ranking. So this strategy involves performance comparisons by name for physicians. And I have seen this myself for a physician group that I used to work in, where by name, the outpatient primary care physicians had their immunization rates, and this is pre-COVID, right? So we're just talking adult immunizations for pneumonia and shingles and flu shots and tetanus, etc. And they showed what percentage of their patient panel was compliant with the immunizations that they should be getting. And frankly, the variation was astonishing. I mean, the really high-end physicians had like 98% of their patients that had gotten their immunizations. And there were folks that were as low as 65%. And the folks that were 65%, it had their name on it. And the folks, and you knew who they were. And you scratched their head. They showed it to the entire physician group. You're like, look at that person's numbers. That's pretty low. I wonder why that is. Guess what happened? The people on the bottom, they changed their behavior. And the entire group's immunizations rate went up. Okay, next up, threshold effect. What does this mean? This means that people will work harder the closer they get to a goal, in other words, the threshold, but once they reach that goal, then they don't work as hard anymore. So just know that whatever incentive you put in place to get the behavior change, that once that incentive is reached, then you need to expect that the behavior might revert. And so therefore you need to structure your incentive in a way to take account for the threshold effect. Next up, limits of willpower. I love this one. Guess what? Vigilance, personal vigilance, is unsustainable. In my opinion, this is probably one of the greatest sources of physician burnout, is you just have to be hyper vigilant in the hospital and in the clinic. I mean, you have to be looking constantly for stuff to go wrong. And there's things constantly beeping and there's alerts on the EMR. You've got to be hyper vigilant and you've got to decide which ones of those are and are not worth your time and how severe, and you got to triage all this stuff. Guess what? That is unsustainable. To be personally vigilant for 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, 5, 6, 7 days a week. A lot of physicians, they'll work stretches of 14, 21 days straight. Like, that's unsustainable. Like, you would never, so what you do is you have to put in systems in place. And in fact, there's a specific example where an outpatient clinic, they didn't even have the doctors review the preventive care, gaps in care anymore. So for preventive screening and for immunizations, the docs didn't even review it. They had the nurses review it, and they would follow up with the patients, and they had the ability to then bring them in for their shots or refer them for their mammograms or their colonoscopies, whatever. They didn't even involve the physician because the willpower of the physician to just be vigilant enough, to be vigilant, was too much. So you have to systematize it. You have to put it in a process. You can't just rely on the physician's vigilance to be your strategy for success. Okay, lastly, mental accounting. I love this one because it's so obvious. You have to separate the bonus payment. If you're making a bonus payment, do not put it in with their bi-weekly paycheck. Do not put it in, if you're doing a bonus, don't put it in with their end of quarter or their end of year paycheck. They won't care. Like, you need to carve it out. This is where specifically Mass General wrote individual checks, hard copy checks. This is the 21st century. Mass General wrote checks and mailed them to doctors' personal home addresses because they wanted it to stand out. How many doctors get checks from their hospital system, hard copy checks to their home? Like, probably zero. So the fact that they were actually getting a check from Mass General totally stood out. Again, what does sending checks to people's home address, what is that called? That's called more work. It would be much easier to plug in some numbers on a computer and just add it to the electronic payment into their bank account at the end of the month. But they didn't do that on purpose because they took this into account. Now, why do all of these strategies need to appear? Why do they need to be? Not all of them, not all in the same priority, not all in the same fashion, but why do these strategies need to exist to change physician behavior? Because of what I said at the beginning of the presentation, which is the current fee-for-service system. This article says fee-for-service incentivizes one thing. It incentivizes RVU, relative value unit, maximization. Look at that. Fee-for-service doesn't maximize quality. Fee-for-service doesn't maximize cost effectiveness. Fee-for-service doesn't maximize access for patients. They themselves, all these experts that wrote this article said, fee-for-service maximizes RVUs, and that needs to stop. And here are 9 ways to stop it. And that's my point for today. Thank you for watching AHealthcareZ.